Imagine developing a roll of family photographs from your vacation, expecting to see the usual collection of smiling faces and scenic landscapes, only to discover an additional figure in every image, someone who had died 3 years before the trip was even taken. A woman whose presence seems so natural, so perfectly integrated into each composition that you almost don't notice her at first. But once you see her, once you recognize who she is, the impossible nature of her appearance transforms pleasant memories into a nightmare of questions that have no rational answers. This is the story of how one family's discovery of posthumous photographs revealed that death might not be the absolute boundary they had always believed it to be, and that some bonds transcend even the grave in ways that challenge everything we think we understand about the nature of existence, memory, and the power of love to persist beyond the limits of mortality. The year was 1952, and in the suburban town of Willowbrook, Illinois, the Brennan family had just returned from their first vacation since the end of World War II. Thomas Brennan, a returning veteran who had built a successful insurance business, had finally felt prosperous enough to take his wife Margaret and their 3 children, Robert 16, Susan 14, and little James 8, on a 2-week trip to the Wisconsin Dells, a journey that represented both celebration and healing for a family that had weathered the hardships of war and loss. The trip had been Margaret's idea, a way to create new memories and help the family move forward after the tragic death of Thomas's mother, Eleanor Brennan, who had passed away from cancer in 1949. Eleanor had been the cornerstone of the family, a woman whose strength and warmth had held them together through Thomas's deployment overseas and the rationing and uncertainty of the war years. Her death had left a void that the family was still struggling to fill 3 years later. Thomas had brought along his new Kodak Brownie camera, determined to document every moment of their first real family vacation. He photographed the children feeding ducks by the lake, Margaret reading peacefully in the shade of an old oak tree, the family gathered around their picnic table, and countless scenic views of the Wisconsin countryside. The camera had been a luxury purchase. But Thomas felt it was important to preserve these memories, to create a photographic record of their family's new beginning. When they returned to Willowbrook, Thomas took the exposed film to Patterson's photography studio on Main Street, where Mr. Harold Patterson had been developing film for the community for over 20 years. Patterson was known for his meticulous work and quick turnaround, and he promised to have the vacation photographs ready within 3 days. The family eagerly anticipated seeing their vacation memories preserved in black and white. Margaret had already purchased a new photo album, and Susan had volunteered to help arrange the pictures chronologically. Even young James was excited to see himself in the photographs, having never been the subject of so many pictures before. When Thomas picked up the developed photographs on a Thursday afternoon, he initially felt nothing but satisfaction as he flipped through the stack of images. The pictures had turned out beautifully, clear, well composed, and perfectly capturing the joy and relaxation of their vacation. The children looked happy and carefree. Margaret appeared more peaceful than she had in years, and the scenic shots of the Dells provided a lovely backdrop to their family memories. It wasn't until he arrived home and spread the photographs across the dining room table for the family to see that anyone noticed the anomaly that would transform their understanding of reality itself. Susan was the first to spot her. "Papa," she said, her voice puzzled as she held up a photograph of the family gathered around their picnic table. "Who is this woman sitting next to Mama?" Thomas looked at the photograph Susan was holding and felt his heart stop. There, seated beside Margaret with perfect clarity and natural positioning, was his mother, Eleanor Brennan, looking exactly as she had before her illness began to ravage her body. She wore a blue dress that Thomas remembered well, one of her favorites that had been buried with her in 1949. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her hands folded gracefully in her lap, and her expression was one of serene contentment as she gazed lovingly at her grandchildren. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered, taking the photograph from Susan's trembling hands. "That's Grandma Eleanor, but she died 3 years ago." The family began examining the other photographs more carefully, and what they discovered defied all rational explanation. Eleanor appeared in every single photograph from their vacation, sometimes prominently positioned among the family group, sometimes standing quietly in the background, sometimes partially visible, where she shook the air at the edge of the frame. In each image, she appeared solid, three-dimensional, and perfectly integrated into the scene, as if she had been physically present throughout their entire trip. In the photograph of the children feeding ducks, Eleanor stood behind them, her hand resting gently on little James's shoulder. In the scenic shots of the lake at sunset, her silhouette could be seen reflected in the water alongside those of the living family members. Most remarkably, in the family's group portrait taken by a helpful stranger near the famous rock formations, Eleanor stood directly behind Thomas, her hands placed lovingly on his shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and blessing. Robert, the eldest child and most practical member of the family, attempted to find logical explanations for what they were seeing. Maybe it's a double exposure, he suggested, or some kind of chemical error in the developing process. Maybe Mr. Patterson accidentally mixed our film with someone else's. But Thomas, who had been meticulous about documenting exactly when and where each photograph had been taken, knew that no such explanation could account for the consistency and integration of Eleanor's appearances. She wasn't superimposed over the images like a double exposure would create. She was clearly present in the actual scenes, interacting naturally with the environment and positioned in ways that suggested she had been physically there when the photographs were taken. Margaret, who had been closest to Eleanor during her lifetime, was the most shaken by the discovery. "I can remember exactly when each of these pictures was taken," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember where we were all standing, what we were doing, what we were talking about, but I have no memory whatsoever of Mother Eleanor being there. How is it possible that she appears so clearly in the photographs when none of us remember seeing her?" The family spent hours examining each photograph with magnifying glasses, searching for any evidence that Eleanor's image had been artificially added or manipulated. But every technical analysis supported the conclusion that she had been genuinely present when the photographs were taken. The lighting on her figure matched the ambient light in each scene. Her shadow fell in the correct direction and length. Her reflection appeared naturally in water and glass surfaces. Even her clothing showed appropriate wrinkles and fabric draping that indicated physical presence rather than artistic insertion. Young James, with the uncomplicated acceptance that children often display toward the mysterious, was the first to voice what the adults were afraid to consider. "Maybe Grandma Eleanor wanted to come with us on vacation," he said simply. "Maybe she missed us and decided to come along, but she didn't want to scare us by letting us see her." The suggestion that Eleanor had somehow accompanied them on their vacation in spirit form was both comforting and terrifying. If she had indeed been present, it meant that death was not the final separation they had believed it to be, but it also raised disturbing questions about the nature of their reality and their ability to perceive what was actually happening around them. Over the following days, the family found themselves studying the photographs obsessively, discovering new details with each examination. Eleanor's expressions were not static. They varied from image to image, suggesting emotional responses to different moments during the trip. In photographs where the children were laughing and playing, she appeared joyful and animated. In quieter moments, her expression was peaceful and contemplative. During the family's group portrait, her face radiated a profound love and pride that brought tears to Thomas's eyes. Margaret began to notice that Eleanor's positioning in the photographs seemed intentional and meaningful. She always appeared closest to whichever family member seemed to need comfort or support at the moment the photograph was taken. When Susan had been crying over a scraped knee, Eleanor stood directly behind her with her hands extended in a gesture of comfort. When Thomas had been struggling with the vacation planning, Eleanor appeared beside him with an expression of encouragement and guidance. The discovery of Eleanor's presence in their vacation photographs began to affect each family member differently. Thomas found himself torn between wonder and concern. Grateful for what seemed to be evidence of his mother's continued love and involvement in their lives, but worried about the implications of her invisible presence. If she had been with them during their vacation without their knowledge, when else might she be watching over them? Was she a constant unseen presence in their daily lives? Margaret experienced a complex mixture of comfort and unease. While part of her was moved by the apparent evidence that Eleanor's love transcended death, another part felt disturbed by the idea that they were being watched by someone they could not see or interact with. The thought that her every action might be observed by her deceased mother-in-law created a sense of self-consciousness that made normal daily activities feel strange and artificial. Susan, at 14, was fascinated by the mystery, but also frightened by its implications. She began to scrutinize family photographs from before Eleanor's death, wondering if she might find evidence of other deceased relatives making appearances in images from years past. The possibility that the dead might be routinely present in family gatherings, invisible to the living but clearly visible to photographic equipment, opened up disturbing questions about the nature of privacy and the boundaries between worlds. Robert approached the phenomenon with teenage skepticism, insisting there had to be a scientific explanation, even as the evidence seemed to contradict every rational theory he proposed. He spent hours researching photographic techniques and developing processes, convinced that understanding the technical aspects might reveal how Eleanor's image had appeared in their pictures through natural rather than supernatural means. Little James, with characteristic childhood adaptability, simply accepted that Grandma Eleanor had joined their vacation and began talking to the empty spaces around him, assuming she might be present even when she wasn't visible. His innocent conversations with his supposedly present grandmother both charmed and disturbed the other family members, who weren't sure whether to encourage or discourage his apparent comfort with the supernatural situation. As word of the mysterious photographs began to spread through Willowbrook's close-knit community, the Brennan family found themselves at the center of intense curiosity and speculation. Neighbors and friends requested to see the photographs, and reactions ranged from wonder to skepticism to outright fear. Some viewed the images as miraculous evidence of life after death, while others insisted there had to be a logical explanation that didn't involve supernatural intervention. Mr. Harold Patterson, the photographer who had developed the film, was particularly disturbed by the situation. His reputation for technical excellence was suddenly under scrutiny as people wondered whether he might have accidentally or intentionally manipulated the photographs. He examined his developing equipment repeatedly, searching for any malfunction that might explain the anomalous images, but found nothing that could account for Eleanor's consistent appearances. In 30 years of developing photographs, he told Thomas during a lengthy consultation, "I have never encountered anything like this. The images show no signs of manipulation, double exposure, or chemical contamination. From a technical standpoint, these photographs appear to document exactly what they show. Your mother was present during your vacation, even though you and your family have no memory of seeing her." Religious leaders in Willowbrook were equally puzzled by the phenomenon. Father McKenna at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, where Eleanor had been a devout parishioner, viewed the photographs as possible evidence of divine intervention or angelic presence. Pastor Williams at First Presbyterian Church was more cautious, warning that spiritual manifestations could be misleading and that the family should be careful not to place too much emphasis on what might be merely unusual photographic coincidences. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the town's only psychiatrist, offered to counsel the family about what she termed grief-induced perceptual anomalies. She suggested that their intense desire to have Eleanor present during their first major family celebration since her death might have somehow influenced their perception of the photographs, causing them to see maternal figures where none actually existed. But even Dr. Harper had to admit that the consistency and technical quality of Eleanor's appearances in the photographs challenged conventional explanations. While grief can indeed cause people to perceive the presence of deceased loved ones, she acknowledged, it typically affects human perception rather than photographic equipment. The fact that multiple people see the same figure in the same positions suggests we're dealing with something beyond simple psychological projection. As the summer of 1952 progressed, the Brennan family found themselves living in two realities simultaneously. Their daily lives continued normally, with work, school, and household routines proceeding as they always had. But underneath this surface normality lay the constant awareness that Eleanor might be present with them, watching over them, sharing in their experiences, even though they couldn't see or communicate with her directly. The vacation photographs remained on the dining room table, examined daily by family members who continued to discover new details and nuances in Eleanor's expressions and positioning. Each viewing revealed new evidence of her apparent awareness and emotional engagement with the family's activities, creating a growing sense that death had not severed her connection to those she loved most. But what none of them yet realized was that Eleanor's appearance in their vacation photographs was not an isolated incident. The phenomenon that had begun with their trip to Wisconsin Dells was about to expand in ways that would challenge not only their understanding of death and family bonds, but their ability to distinguish between memory and reality, between the living and the dead, between what was possible and what was impossible. The woman who had appeared in their family photos years after her death was preparing to make her presence known in ways that would transform the Brennan family's understanding of existence itself. 3 months had passed since the discovery of Eleanor's presence in the Wisconsin vacation photographs, and what had initially seemed like an isolated miracle was beginning to reveal itself as something far more complex and unsettling. The Brennan family had settled into an uneasy routine of living with the knowledge that Eleanor might be invisibly present in their daily lives, but they were unprepared for what happened when Thomas decided to have their regular family portraits taken for the upcoming Christmas season. The appointment at Patterson's photography studio was scheduled for a crisp November afternoon in 1952. The family had prepared carefully, with Margaret ensuring that everyone's clothing was properly coordinated and the children's hair was neatly combed. It was to be their first professional family portrait since before the war, and Margaret was particularly excited about creating a formal photograph that would serve as their official family image for years to come. Thomas had said nothing to Mr. Patterson about the anomalous vacation photographs, hoping to conduct what amounted to an unofficial experiment. If Eleanor appeared in professional studio portraits taken under controlled conditions, it would confirm that her posthumous presence was not limited to outdoor vacation snapshots, but represented a genuine supernatural phenomenon that could manifest under any photographic circumstances. The portrait session proceeded normally, with Mr. Patterson positioning the family in various formal arrangements around his studio. Thomas and Margaret sat in chairs while the children stood behind them. Then they rearranged themselves with the children seated on the floor and the parents standing. The photographer took multiple shots of each arrangement, ensuring they would have several images to choose from. During the session, none of the family members noticed anything unusual. The studio was well lit and contained no shadows or hidden spaces where an additional person might have concealed herself. Mr. Patterson worked alone, and there were no other clients or visitors present. The family felt confident that if Eleanor were to appear in these photographs, her presence would be undeniably supernatural rather than the result of any technical error or external influence. When the family returned a week later to view the developed portraits, Mr. Patterson's expression was troubled as he led them to his viewing room. "I need to show you something," he said quietly, "and I want you to know that I've checked and double-checked my equipment and developing process. I can find no technical explanation for what you're about to see." The formal family portraits were beautifully executed, with perfect lighting and composition that showcased Mr. Patterson's professional expertise. But in every single photograph, Eleanor Brennan stood directly behind Thomas's chair, her hands resting on his shoulders in a gesture of maternal support and protection. She wore the same blue dress from the vacation photographs, and her expression radiated pride and love as she gazed at her assembled family. What made Eleanor's presence even more remarkable in these studio portraits was the clarity and detail with which she appeared. Unlike the vacation photographs, where lighting conditions and outdoor settings might have obscured fine details, the controlled studio environment revealed Eleanor with perfect sharpness. Every aspect of her appearance was clearly visible: the texture of her dress fabric, the style of her hair, even the familiar jewelry she had always worn. Margaret gasped when she saw the first portrait. "She's so clear, so perfectly detailed. It's as if she really was standing there during the session." Mr. Patterson nodded grimly. "That's exactly what troubles me. In all my years of professional photography, I've learned to notice when additional people are present during a session. I was watching your family the entire time, making sure everyone was properly positioned and looking at the camera. I would swear under oath that only the 5 of you were in my studio that day." Susan, now more fascinated than frightened by her grandmother's mysterious appearances, studied the portraits with intense curiosity. "Look at her expression," she said, pointing to Eleanor's face in one of the images. "She's looking directly at the camera, as if she knew she was being photographed. That's not how someone would look if they were just accidentally caught in the picture." Robert, still searching for rational explanations, examined the photographs for any evidence of manipulation or double exposure. But the studio portraits offered even stronger evidence of Eleanor's genuine presence than the vacation photographs had. The controlled lighting conditions made it impossible to hide any technical tricks, and Eleanor's positioning behind Thomas's chair was so natural and integrated that it appeared she had been carefully posed along with the rest of the family. Young James, who had grown comfortable with the idea that Grandma Eleanor was invisibly present in their lives, smiled broadly when he saw the portraits. "She looks so happy to be in the picture with us," he said with childlike delight. "I wish we could see her when she's here, so we could talk to her." The implications of Eleanor's appearance in professional studio portraits were staggering for the family. If she could manifest clearly enough to be photographed under controlled conditions, it suggested that her posthumous presence was not a random or accidental phenomenon, but represented a deliberate and ongoing involvement in their family life. Thomas found himself deeply moved by the studio portraits, particularly by the protective gesture of Eleanor's hands on his shoulders. "She always did that when I was young," he told Margaret quietly. "Whenever I was nervous or scared about something, she would stand behind me and put her hands on my shoulders exactly like that. It was her way of letting me know that she believed in me and would support me no matter what happened." But along with the comfort came disturbing questions. If Eleanor was present during their formal portrait session, when else might she be watching them? Was she a constant invisible presence in their home, observing their private moments and family interactions? The idea of being perpetually watched by someone they couldn't see or acknowledge began to create a sense of unease that affected the family's daily routines. Margaret became increasingly self-conscious about her appearance and behavior, wondering if Eleanor might be judging her housekeeping, her parenting, or her care of the family that had once been Eleanor's primary responsibility. The relationship between the two women had always been cordial but complex, and Margaret worried about how Eleanor might view the changes she had made to the household since becoming its primary female authority figure. The children began to modify their behavior in subtle ways, speaking more politely to each other and being more careful about their table manners, as if aware that they might be under constant observation by their deceased grandmother. Susan started keeping her room neater, while Robert found himself studying harder, unconsciously seeking approval from an invisible presence. Dr. Harper, when consulted about the studio portrait phenomenon, expressed serious concern about the psychological effects of living with the belief that they were under constant supernatural observation. "While the photographs themselves are certainly unusual," she told Thomas during a private consultation, "my primary concern is for your family's mental health. Living with the constant awareness of an unseen presence can create anxiety, paranoia, and difficulty distinguishing between normal family life and supernatural influence." But before Dr. Harper could recommend a course of treatment, the phenomenon expanded again in a way that challenged everyone's understanding of what was happening. Margaret, while organizing family photographs in preparation for creating a comprehensive family album, made a discovery that retroactively changed their entire understanding of Eleanor's posthumous appearances. While examining older family photographs taken during Eleanor's lifetime, Margaret began to notice figures in the background that she had never seen before, people who appeared to be deceased relatives from earlier generations, standing quietly behind the living family members in various group photographs dating back to the 1930s. In a photograph from Thomas's wedding day in 1934, Margaret could clearly see an elderly man standing behind Eleanor who bore a strong resemblance to Thomas's grandfather who had died in 1931. In Christmas photographs from the late 1930s, a middle-aged woman who looked remarkably like Eleanor's sister Catherine appeared near the family Christmas tree, despite the fact that Catherine had died of influenza in 1936. The retroactive discovery of deceased relatives in older family photographs suggested that Eleanor's posthumous appearances were part of a larger pattern that had been occurring for decades without anyone noticing. It was as if the photographic process had always been capable of capturing the presence of deceased family members, but the living had simply not been aware enough to recognize them. "How many of our family photographs contain people we've never noticed?" Margaret asked Thomas as they spread dozens of old pictures across their dining room table. "How many times have we looked at these images without seeing the deceased relatives who were apparently present during family gatherings?" The systematic examination of their family photographic collection revealed a complex pattern of posthumous appearances that seemed to follow specific rules and limitations. Deceased relatives appeared most frequently in photographs taken during significant family events, weddings, birthdays, holidays, and other celebrations. They typically positioned themselves in background areas where they would not interfere with the primary subjects of the photographs. And they seemed to appear most commonly in images where multiple generations of the family were gathered together. Thomas's father, who had died in a factory accident in 1945, could be found in several photographs taken during Thomas's return from military service, standing proudly behind his son in uniform. Margaret's mother, who had passed away in 1947, appeared in photographs from Susan's confirmation ceremony, smiling benevolently as her granddaughter received the sacrament. The discovery that their family photographs had been documenting supernatural presences for decades without their awareness created a profound shift in how they understood their family history. Events they remembered as involving only living relatives were revealed to have included the invisible participation of deceased family members who had apparently chosen to attend important family celebrations. Susan, with the investigative enthusiasm of a teenager, began creating a detailed catalogue of all the posthumous appearances in their family photographs, noting the dates, occasions, and positioning of each deceased relative. Her research revealed patterns that suggested the dead were not randomly appearing in photographs, but were making conscious decisions about when and where to manifest their presence. They almost never appear in everyday photographs, she reported to the family after weeks of careful analysis. They show up for birthdays, holidays, weddings, graduations, the kinds of events where family members who were still alive would make special efforts to attend. It's as if they're still participating in our family celebrations, even though we can't see them. Robert, initially skeptical of the supernatural explanation, found himself convinced by the sheer volume and consistency of the evidence. The posthumous appearances followed patterns that would be impossible to achieve through photographic manipulation or coincidental double exposures, especially in photographs taken with different cameras under various lighting conditions over a period of decades. Young James, characteristically accepting of the miraculous, began talking to empty spaces during family gatherings, assuming that deceased relatives might be present even when not visible in photographs. His innocent conversations with invisible family members both amused and disturbed the adults, who weren't sure how to guide a child who seemed comfortable communicating with the dead. The expanding awareness of posthumous presences in their family photographs began to affect the Brennan family's relationship with death itself. The clear evidence that deceased relatives continued to participate in family events challenged their understanding of mortality and suggested that family bonds might indeed transcend the boundaries between life and death. But this comfort came with complications. If deceased relatives were invisibly present during family gatherings, it meant that privacy and intimacy had different meanings than the living family members had assumed. Arguments, celebrations, tender moments, and everyday interactions were all potentially witnessed by unseen family members whose judgments and reactions remained unknowable. Margaret found herself speaking aloud to Eleanor during daily household tasks, explaining her decisions about family management and seeking approval for changes she had made to routines that Eleanor had established. Thomas began visiting Eleanor's grave more frequently, reporting to her about family developments and asking for guidance about parenting decisions. The children developed their own individual relationships with the concept of invisible deceased relatives. Susan created a detailed family tree that included information about when and where each deceased relative had appeared in photographs, treating the supernatural phenomenon as a genealogical research project. Robert began carrying his grandfather's pocket watch, hoping to feel some connection to the family members who seemed to be watching over them. James started setting extra places at the dinner table for deceased relatives, creating physical spaces for family members who might be present but invisible. As 1952 drew to a close, the Brennan family had fundamentally changed their understanding of family, death, and the boundaries between worlds. What had begun as a single anomalous appearance in vacation photographs had revealed a complex pattern of posthumous family participation that extended back for decades and forward into an uncertain future. But they were unprepared for what would happen when other families in Willowbrook began examining their own family photographs more carefully, searching for evidence of similar supernatural presences. The phenomenon that had seemed unique to the Brennan family was about to reveal itself as something far more widespread and disturbing than anyone had imagined. The revelation that the Brennan family's photographs had been documenting posthumous appearances for decades created ripple effects throughout Willowbrook that no one could have anticipated. As word spread about their discovery, other families began examining their own photographic collections with new awareness, searching for evidence of deceased relatives who might have been invisibly participating in family events. What they found challenged not only individual family histories, but the entire community's understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead. Mrs. Dorothy Hennessy, the Brennans' next-door neighbor, was among the first to make similar discoveries in her own family photographs. During a coffee visit with Margaret in December 1952, she mentioned that she had been inspired to look through her own family albums after hearing about Eleanor's appearances. I thought it was just a coincidence at first, Mrs. Hennessy told Margaret, as they sat in the Brennan kitchen, surrounded by both families' photograph collections. But when I started really looking carefully at pictures from my daughter's wedding last spring, I noticed a woman standing behind the bride's party who looked remarkably like my late mother. She died in 1948, but there she was, clear as day, wearing the dress she was buried in. The systematic examination of the Hennessy family photographs revealed a pattern similar to what the Brennans had discovered. Deceased relatives appeared consistently in photographs taken during significant family events, positioned carefully so as not to interfere with the primary subjects while still maintaining visible presence in the images. Most remarkably, the posthumous appearances seem to span multiple generations, with some photographs containing deceased relatives from several different time periods gathered together as if attending a multi-generational family reunion. Word of the Hennessy discoveries spread quickly through Willowbrook's interconnected community, and soon other families were conducting their own investigations of family photographs. The results were both fascinating and disturbing, as family after family discovered evidence of posthumous presences that had gone unnoticed for years or even decades. The Patterson family, owners of the photography studio where the phenomena had first been documented professionally, found their own collection contained numerous examples of deceased relatives appearing in family portraits. Mr. Patterson's late father, who had founded the photography business in the 1920s, could be seen standing proudly behind his son in photographs taken during the studio's expansion in the 1940s, years after his death from heart disease. Dr. William Morrison, Willowbrook's longtime family physician, discovered that his deceased first wife appeared in several photographs taken during his second marriage ceremony in 1947. Rather than seeming disapproving of his remarriage, she appeared to be blessing the union, standing behind him with her hand resting gently on his shoulder in a gesture of support and understanding. The Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who had settled in Willowbrook in the 1920s, found evidence of deceased relatives who had never even emigrated to America appearing in their family photographs. Elderly figures in traditional Polish clothing could be seen in backgrounds of birthday celebrations and Christmas gatherings, suggesting that family connections transcended not only death, but geographical boundaries as well. As more families came forward with evidence of posthumous photographic appearances, patterns began to emerge that suggested the phenomenon followed specific rules and limitations. Dr. Harper, working with a growing group of families affected by the discoveries, began documenting the common characteristics of the supernatural appearances. The deceased relatives seemed to appear most frequently during celebrations and significant family milestones, she noted in her research files. They positioned themselves carefully to avoid disrupting the primary purpose of the photographs while still maintaining visible presence. Their clothing typically reflects how they appeared during their lifetimes, often featuring garments that held special significance or were associated with important memories. More intriguingly, the posthumous appearances seem to involve only close family members, parents, grandparents, siblings, and spouses, rather than distant relatives or non-family connections. This suggested that the phenomenon was specifically related to strong emotional bonds rather than casual familial relationships. Father McKenna at St. Ead's, Joseph's Catholic Church, found himself counseling numerous families who were struggling to understand the theological implications of their discoveries. Many parishioners are asking whether these appearances represent souls in purgatory seeking prayers, blessed spirits watching over their families, or something else entirely, he wrote in his diocesan report. The consistency and apparent benevolence of the manifestations suggest divine rather than demonic influence, but the unprecedented nature of the phenomenon requires careful theological consideration. Pastor Williams at First Presbyterian Church took a more cautious approach, warning his congregation about the dangers of placing too much emphasis on what might be merely unusual photographic coincidences. However, even he had to acknowledge the mounting evidence when his own family photographs revealed the presence of his deceased father during his ordination ceremony in 1945. The community-wide recognition of posthumous photographic presences created both comfort and anxiety among Willowbrook's residents. Many families found solace in what appeared to be evidence that their deceased loved ones continued to participate in family celebrations and significant events. Parents grieving the loss of children felt particular comfort in seeing their deceased offspring apparently continuing to grow and develop in family photographs, suggesting that death had not ended their participation in family life. But the discoveries also created disturbing questions about privacy, autonomy, and the nature of family relationships. If deceased relatives were invisibly present during family gatherings, it meant that living family members had no private space or personal moments that were not potentially observed and judged by unseen watchers. Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, whose husband had died in Korea just 2 years earlier, found evidence that he had appeared in photographs taken during her tentative attempts to begin dating again. Rather than finding comfort in his continued presence, she felt deeply disturbed by what seemed like supernatural surveillance of her personal life. "I want to move forward and eventually remarry," she told Dr. Harper during a counseling session, "but how can I develop new relationships when my deceased husband might be invisibly present, watching and judging everything I do? The idea that he's still here, still involved in my daily life, makes it impossible for me to begin the grieving process and create space for new love." Similar concerns arose in other families where the posthumous presences seemed to complicate rather than comfort family dynamics. Adult children who had difficult relationships with deceased parents found the evidence of continued surveillance disturbing rather than reassuring. Spouses who had remarried after being widowed struggled with the implications of their deceased partners apparently remaining involved in their new relationships. The psychological impact of living with awareness of invisible deceased family members began to manifest in various ways throughout the community. Children became more well-behaved, but also more anxious, unsure whether their actions were being observed and evaluated by unseen grandparents or other relatives. Adults found themselves modifying their behavior and speech patterns, unconsciously seeking approval from family members they could not see or communicate with directly. Dr. Harper documented numerous cases of what she termed posthumous performance anxiety, a condition in which individuals became so concerned about potential observation by deceased family members that they struggled to act naturally in their own homes and during family gatherings. "People are beginning to live as if they're constantly on stage," she observed, performing idealized versions of themselves for an invisible audience of deceased relatives whose reactions and judgments they cannot know or understand. This creates tremendous psychological pressure and can lead to anxiety, depression, and difficulty maintaining authentic relationships with living family members. The situation became more complex when several families reported that the posthumous presences seemed to be increasing in frequency and visibility over time. What had initially been subtle background appearances in occasional photographs were becoming more prominent and occurring in a wider range of family pictures. Thomas Brennan noticed this escalation in his own family's photographs when he had Christmas pictures taken in December 1952. Eleanor appeared not only more prominently than in previous images, but she seemed to be accompanied by other deceased relatives, Thomas's father, Margaret's mother, and even his grandfather, who had died when Thomas was a young child. "It's as if they're multiplying," Margaret observed with growing concern as they examined the latest batch of family photographs. What started with just Eleanor appearing occasionally has become a gathering of deceased relatives in every family picture. How many invisible family members are actually present during our daily lives? The escalation of posthumous appearances reached a crisis point when several families reported that the deceased relatives were beginning to appear in everyday photographs rather than just special occasions. Candid snapshots taken during routine family activities, meals, household chores, children playing, started showing background figures that family members recognized as deceased relatives. Young James Brennan was among the first to report direct communication with the invisible presences. During Christmas dinner, 1952, he began responding to questions and comments that no one else could hear, carrying on detailed conversations with what he claimed were his deceased grandparents and other relatives. "Grandma Eleanor says she's proud of how well I'm doing in school," James announced to his bewildered family during the meal. "And Great-Grandpa says he likes the way Papa fixed the front porch, but he thinks the Christmas tree should be moved closer to the window so people can see it better from the street." The accuracy of information that James claimed to receive from invisible deceased relatives was disturbing to the adult family members. He knew details about family history and deceased relatives' preferences that he had never been taught, suggesting that he was indeed receiving communication from sources beyond his own knowledge and experience. Other children in Willowbrook began reporting similar communications with deceased family members, creating a generation of young people who seemed to exist simultaneously in the worlds of the living and the dead. These children displayed knowledge and maturity beyond their years, often providing comfort and guidance to grieving adults based on messages they claimed to receive from deceased relatives. The phenomena reached community-wide recognition when the Willowbrook Herald newspaper published an article titled "Local Families Report Mysterious Photographic Appearances" in January 1953. The article, written by reporter Janet Mitchell, attempted to maintain journalistic objectivity while documenting what was clearly an unprecedented supernatural phenomenon affecting multiple families throughout the community. What began as an isolated curiosity in one family's vacation photographs has evolved into a community-wide phenomenon that challenges conventional understanding of photography, death, and family relationships, Mitchell wrote. More than 30 families in Willowbrook have now reported discovering deceased relatives in their family photographs, with appearances dating back decades in some cases. The newspaper article attracted attention from beyond Willowbrook's boundaries, drawing researchers, journalists, and curiosity seekers from across the Midwest. Dr. Margaret Hayes, a professor of psychology from the University of Chicago, arrived in February 1953 to conduct a systematic investigation of what she termed collective posthumous manifestation syndrome. Dr. Hayes's preliminary research revealed patterns that extended beyond individual family experiences into community-wide phenomena that suggested coordinated supernatural activity. The consistency of the manifestations across multiple families indicates that we are dealing with something more complex than individual grief responses or isolated photographic anomalies, she reported in her initial findings. The deceased individuals appear to be operating according to shared principles and purposes that transcend individual family relationships. Her investigation also revealed that the posthumous appearances were not random or chaotic, but followed sophisticated patterns that suggested intelligence and organization. Deceased relatives appeared most frequently during specific types of family events, positioned themselves according to apparent protocols that avoided disrupting primary family interactions, and seemed to coordinate their appearances with other deceased family members in ways that created coherent group dynamics. Most remarkably, Dr. Hayes discovered evidence that deceased relatives from different families were appearing together in photographs taken during community events. Church gatherings, school activities, and civic celebrations revealed background figures that residents recognized as deceased community members who had apparently chosen to attend public events alongside their living neighbors. The community photograph from Willowbrook's 1952 4th of July celebration became a particular focus of fascination and concern. When examined carefully, the image revealed dozens of deceased residents standing among the living crowd, creating a gathering where the dead outnumbered the living by a significant margin. Former mayors, deceased teachers, and longtime residents who had passed away over the previous decades could all be identified in the photograph, suggesting that death had not ended their participation in community life. We are witnessing the emergence of a parallel community of the deceased that exists alongside the living population, Dr. Hayes wrote in her research notes. The posthumous residents of Willowbrook appear to maintain their own social structures, relationships, and civic involvement, creating a form of afterlife society that mirrors but transcends the boundaries of physical existence. The implications of a parallel community of the deceased created significant anxiety among Willowbrook's living residents. If deceased community members were invisibly present during public events, civic meetings, and social gatherings, it meant that the living population was consistently outnumbered by unseen observers whose opinions and influences remained unknowable. Mayor Robert Patterson, whose own deceased father had appeared in numerous civic photographs, struggled with the implications for municipal governance. How can we make decisions about community development and public policy when we don't know how many unseen residents might be affected by our choices? He asked during an emergency town council meeting. Do we have obligations to deceased citizens who apparently continue to live in Willowbrook in some form? The theological implications of a community where the dead outnumbered the living challenged local religious leaders to reconsider fundamental doctrines about death, afterlife, and the relationship between earthly and spiritual existence. Father McKenna and Pastor Williams found themselves collaborating on what amounted to a completely new form of pastoral care for families navigating relationships with deceased relatives who remained actively involved in daily life. Traditional approaches to grief counseling assume that death creates separation that must be accepted and integrated, Father McKenna observed. But how do we counsel families when the deceased appear to remain present and involved in ongoing family dynamics? How do we help people move through grief processes when their loved ones have not actually departed, The educational system faced particular challenges, as teachers discovered that their classrooms might contain invisible deceased former educators and family members of students. Children's behavior and academic performance began changing in ways that suggested they were aware of unseen adult presence and authority, creating discipline and instructional challenges that had no precedent in educational practice. Miss Dorothy Hennessy, a third-grade teacher at Willowbrook Elementary School, reported that her students had begun responding to instructions and comments that she had never given, apparently receiving guidance from deceased relatives or former teachers who were invisibly present in the classroom. I'll announce that it's time for arithmetic, and several students will immediately put away their reading materials and take out their mathematics books before I've given any such instruction, she reported to the school principal. When I asked them why they prepared for arithmetic, they explained that their deceased grandmother or a former teacher told them what to do. It's as if there's a parallel educational system operating alongside my own classroom management. The medical community struggled with the implications of deceased family members who might be present during medical examinations, treatments, and health crises. Dr. Morrison found that patients were increasingly reporting conversations with deceased relatives who offered medical advice, comfort, or warnings about health conditions, creating conflicts between professional, medical judgment, and supernatural guidance. Patients are making treatment decisions based on advice from deceased family members who may have different perspectives on medical intervention than contemporary practice would recommend, Dr. Morrison reported to the State Medical Board. I've had patients refuse necessary treatments because deceased relatives advised against them, and others who demanded specific medications because their deceased mothers or fathers recommended them. The business community faced similar challenges as deceased former owners, partners, and employees appear to remain involved in commercial activities. Shop owners reported finding inventory rearranged according to preferences of deceased business partners, while employees claimed to receive instructions from former supervisors who had died years earlier. Mr. Harold Patterson, whose photography studio had become the center of the phenomenon, found his work increasingly influenced by what appeared to be guidance from his deceased father, who had founded the business decades earlier. Equipment would be adjusted overnight according to techniques his father had preferred, and composition suggestions would appear written in his father's distinctive handwriting on notes that Patterson was certain he had not written himself. I'm running a business with a partner who died 15 years ago, Patterson confided to Thomas Brennan during one of their consultations. Sometimes I feel like I'm merely the living representative of a company that's actually managed by deceased family members who understand photography better than I do. The psychological stress of living in a community where the dead outnumbered and apparently influenced the living began to manifest in various forms of individual and collective dysfunction. Residents reported difficulty making independent decisions without considering the potential reactions of deceased family members and community figures. Social interactions became complicated by awareness that unseen observers might be evaluating every conversation and public behavior. Dr. Harper found herself treating increasing numbers of residents for what she termed posthumous social anxiety, a condition in which individuals became so concerned about invisible observation and judgment that they struggled to function normally in professional, social, and family settings. People are living as if they're in a community theater where the audience consists entirely of deceased relatives and former neighbors, she observed. The constant awareness of unseen watchers has created a form of collective performance anxiety that is preventing residents from living authentically in their own community. The situation reached a breaking point in March 1953 when several families reported that deceased relatives had begun offering unsolicited advice about personal decisions, family conflicts, and community issues. Rather than remaining passive observers, the posthumous presences seemed to be attempting more active involvement in the affairs of the living. Margaret Brennan was among the first to report direct interference from deceased relatives in family decision-making. Eleanor had apparently begun expressing opinions about household management, child-rearing practices, and family financial decisions through young James, who would relay detailed instructions and criticisms from his invisible grandmother. Eleanor says you're not feeding the children enough vegetables, James announced during dinner one evening, and she thinks Papa should ask for a raise at work because the family deserves better than this old house. She also says Susan should stop reading those romance novels because they're giving her unrealistic expectations about marriage. The shift from passive observation to active intervention created new tensions within families as living members struggled to maintain autonomy while acknowledging the apparent presence and opinions of deceased relatives whose judgment and authority they had never fully resolved during their lifetimes. Thomas found himself caught between respect for his mother's continued involvement in family affairs and frustration at having his parental authority undermined by supernatural intervention. Margaret struggled with criticism of her household management from a mother-in-law who had died 3 years earlier, but apparently continued to evaluate her domestic performance. The community was approaching a crisis that would require unprecedented solutions for unprecedented problems. The woman who had appeared in family photos years after her death had opened a doorway that could not easily be closed, revealing that the boundary between life and death was far more permeable than anyone had imagined. By the spring of 1953, Willowbrook had become a community under siege by its own deceased population. What had begun as a mysterious but seemingly benevolent phenomenon, beloved family members appearing in photographs years after their deaths, had evolved into a crisis of supernatural proportions that threatened the autonomy and sanity of every living resident. The posthumous presences were no longer content to remain passive observers in family photographs. They were actively attempting to influence, control, and in some cases replace the decision-making authority of their living relatives. Dr. Margaret Hayes, whose initial research had documented the community-wide nature of the phenomenon, returned to Willowbrook in April 1953 with a team of specialists in psychology, theology, and paranormal investigation. What she found was a town in the grip of what she termed posthumous colonization, a systematic attempt by deceased residents to maintain and expand their influence over the community they had once inhabited in life. The situation in Willowbrook represents an unprecedented breakdown in the boundaries between life and death, Dr. Hayes reported to her university colleagues. The deceased population has not only maintained its connection to the living community, but appears to be actively working to establish a form of dual governance in which the dead exercise equal or superior authority to the living in family and community affairs. The evidence supporting Dr. Hayes' assessment was overwhelming. Families throughout Willowbrook reported that deceased relatives were issuing increasingly specific and demanding instructions about daily life, communicated through children who seemed to serve as unwilling mediums between the living and dead. Business decisions were being influenced by deceased former owners and partners. Municipal governance was being challenged by deceased civic leaders who apparently disagreed with current policy directions. Thomas Brennan, whose family had been at the center of the original discovery, found his household essentially under the control of his deceased mother, Eleanor, who issued daily instructions through young James about everything from meal preparation to financial management to disciplinary approaches for the other children. Eleanor says you need to increase your life insurance policy, James would announce to his father. And she thinks Robert should consider a military career instead of college because young men need discipline more than they need book learning. She also says Margaret is spoiling Susan by letting her wear lipstick before she's 16. The constant stream of posthumous advice and criticism was taking a severe toll on the family's emotional well-being and functional autonomy. Margaret found herself second-guessing every household decision, wondering whether she was failing to meet standards established by a mother-in-law who had died 3 years earlier, but continued to evaluate her domestic performance. Thomas struggled with professional decisions, uncertain whether to follow his own business judgment or the guidance offered by deceased relatives who claimed superior wisdom based on their expanded perspective from beyond the grave. Most disturbing of all was the impact on the children, who were serving as unwilling intermediaries between the living and dead, while struggling to develop their own identities and independence. Susan began showing signs of what Dr. Harper diagnosed as medium fatigue, exhaustion from constant communication with deceased relatives who demanded to be heard and acknowledged. Robert became increasingly withdrawn, overwhelmed by the pressure of living up to expectations set by deceased grandfathers and great-grandfathers whose approval he could never directly confirm. Young James, who had initially seemed comfortable with his role as primary communicator with deceased family members, began displaying symptoms of psychological fragmentation as multiple deceased relatives attempted to speak through him simultaneously. During family meals, he would shift between different voices and personalities, relaying conflicting messages from deceased relatives who apparently disagreed with each other about family matters. Grandma Eleanor says we should move to a bigger house, James would announce in his grandmother's characteristic phrasing and tone. But great-grandpa says we should save more money instead of spending it on luxuries. Grandpa William thinks Papa should change jobs, but Uncle Henry says the insurance business is perfectly respectable. The psychological impact of serving as a conduit for multiple deceased personalities was clearly damaging James's development as an individual child. His own personality and preferences were being overwhelmed by the constant presence of adult voices and opinions, creating what Dr. Harper termed identity displacement syndrome, in which the living child was essentially disappearing beneath the influence of deceased relatives. Similar patterns were occurring in families throughout Willowbrook, creating a generation of children who were more connected to deceased relatives than to their living parents and community. These children displayed knowledge, opinions, and behavioral patterns that reflected the values and preferences of deceased family members rather than contemporary childhood development, creating a form of temporal displacement in which the past was literally colonizing the present. The situation reached a crisis point when several deceased community leaders began attempting to influence municipal governance through their living relatives. Former Mayor Jonathan Whitmore, who had died in 1949, apparently began issuing policy recommendations through his son David, who served on the current town council. The deceased mayor's agenda included reversing zoning decisions made after his death, reinstating community programs that had been discontinued due to budget constraints, and opposing modernization projects that he believed would compromise Willowbrook's traditional character. "My father says the new traffic signals are unnecessary and expensive," David Whitmore announced during a council meeting, speaking in a tone and cadence that other council members recognized as his father's rather than his own. He believes the money would be better spent on park maintenance and library expansion, which were always his priorities when he was alive. The attempt by deceased civic leaders to influence current municipal decision-making created a constitutional crisis for local government. How could elected officials represent the interests of living constituents when they were receiving conflicting instructions from deceased former leaders whose legal authority had ended with their deaths? How could democratic governance function when the dead might outnumber and overrule the living in community decision-making? Mayor Robert Patterson called an emergency town meeting for May 15, 1953, to address what he termed the unprecedented challenge of posthumous civic participation. The meeting, held in the high school auditorium to accommodate the large crowd of concerned residents, would become one of the most significant gatherings in Willowbrook's history. "We face a situation that has no precedent in American municipal governance," Mayor Patterson announced to the packed auditorium. "Our community appears to be inhabited by two populations, the living residents who are legally entitled to participate in democratic decision-making, and deceased former residents who are attempting to maintain influence over community affairs through supernatural means." The town meeting quickly revealed the extent to which posthumous influence had permeated every aspect of community life. Teachers reported that deceased former educators were attempting to influence curriculum decisions. Business owners described pressure from deceased partners and competitors who objected to changes in commercial practices. Religious leaders acknowledged that their congregations were receiving conflicting spiritual guidance from deceased ministers and parishioners. Dr. Hayes, serving as an expert consultant during the meeting, explained that Willowbrook was experiencing what appeared to be a unique form of supernatural phenomenon that combined elements of spiritual manifestation, psychological influence, and social control. "The deceased residents of Willowbrook have not simply maintained a presence in their former community," she told the gathered residents. "They appear to be attempting to establish a form of posthumous authority that would allow them to continue governing family and community affairs from beyond the grave. This represents a fundamental challenge to the autonomy of the living and the natural order of generational succession." The solution that emerged from the town meeting was both radical and unprecedented. The community would need to establish clear boundaries between the authority of the living and the influence of the dead, creating what amounted to a supernatural Bill of Rights that protected living residents from posthumous coercion while acknowledging the apparent reality of continued deceased presence. Father McKenna and Pastor Williams, working together despite their denominational differences, proposed a community-wide ritual of separation that would formally acknowledge the deceased residents' continued existence while establishing clear limits on their ability to influence the affairs of the living. "We must honor our deceased community members while asserting the right of the living to govern their own lives and community," Father McKenna explained. "This will require a formal ceremony that both recognizes the reality of posthumous presence and establishes spiritual boundaries that protect the autonomy of living residents. The ceremony of separation, held on Memorial Day 1953, involved the entire Willowbrook community in a ritual that combined elements of various religious traditions with practical psychology and community organization. Every family participated by formally addressing their deceased relatives, acknowledging their continued love and respect while asserting their right to make independent decisions about family and personal affairs. Thomas Brennan, speaking on behalf of his family to his deceased mother Eleanor, exemplified the approach that other families would follow. "Mother, we know you continue to love us and want what's best for our family. We honor your memory and value the lessons you taught us during your lifetime. But we must now take full responsibility for our own decisions, our own mistakes, and our own successes. We ask for your blessing on our independence, not your control over our choices." The community-wide ceremony had immediate effects that surprised even Dr. Hayes and her research team. The posthumous presences did not disappear entirely, but their influence over daily life diminished significantly. Deceased relatives continued to appear in family photographs, but their expressions shifted from authoritative expectation to benevolent observation. Children stopped serving as mediums for deceased relatives' opinions and instructions, allowing them to develop their own personalities and preferences. Most remarkably, the deceased presences seemed to respect the boundaries that had been established through the ceremony. While they remained visible in photographs, they no longer attempted to influence family decisions or community governance. Their presence became commemorative rather than controlling, creating a form of supernatural coexistence that honored both the dead and the living. James Brennan, who had served as the primary conduit for deceased family members' communications, experienced the most dramatic transformation. Within days of the ceremony, he stopped relaying messages from deceased relatives and began displaying the normal behavioral patterns of an 8-year-old boy. His personality, which had been overwhelmed by adult voices and opinions, reasserted itself as he rediscovered his own interests, preferences, and developmental needs. "It's like getting my son back," Margaret told Dr. Harper during a follow-up consultation. "James is acting like a normal child again instead of a telephone between worlds. He still acknowledges that deceased relatives are present in photographs, but he's no longer carrying their messages or living according to their instructions." The success of Willowbrook's ceremony of separation attracted national attention from religious leaders, psychological researchers, and communities dealing with their own supernatural challenges. The model developed in Willowbrook was adapted and implemented in other locations where similar phenomena had been reported, creating what became known as the Willowbrook Protocol for managing posthumous spiritual presence. Dr. Hayes' final report on the Willowbrook phenomenon became a foundational document in the emerging field of community parapsychology. Her research demonstrated that supernatural manifestations could be addressed through combination of acknowledgement, boundary setting, and community-wide ritual intervention rather than denial or exorcism. The Willowbrook case proves that communities can coexist with supernatural phenomena when appropriate boundaries are established and maintained, she concluded. The key insight is that posthumous presences seek recognition and respect rather than control and dominance. When their continued existence is acknowledged while their authority over living affairs is limited, peaceful coexistence becomes possible. The Brennan family's experience with Eleanor's posthumous appearances evolved into a new form of relationship that honored both her continued presence and their need for autonomous family life. Eleanor continued to appear in family photographs, but her expressions reflected pride and love rather than judgment and control. The family could sense her presence during important events and celebrations, but they made their own decisions about daily life without supernatural interference. Thomas learned to appreciate his mother's continued spiritual presence while asserting his own authority as family patriarch. Margaret developed confidence in her household management without fear of posthumous criticism. The children grew up with awareness of their deceased relatives' continued love and interest while developing their own independent identities and relationships. The family photographs that had initially caused such disruption ultimately became treasured documentation of an extended family that transcended the boundaries between life and death. Eleanor's presence in their vacation pictures, wedding photos, and holiday celebrations served as ongoing confirmation that love persists beyond mortality while respecting the natural progression of family generations and relationships. Today, more than 70 years after Eleanor Brennan first appeared in her family's vacation photographs, the Willowbrook Protocol continues to serve communities dealing with posthumous spiritual manifestations. The model demonstrates that supernatural phenomena need not create fear or chaos when addressed with respect, boundaries, and community cooperation. The woman who appeared in family photos years after her death had revealed that love transcends mortality, but also that the living have the right to govern their own existence while honoring the memory and continued spiritual presence of those who have passed away. The boundary between life and death, while more permeable than previously understood, could be managed in ways that served both the living and the dead. Eleanor's story ultimately became one of redemption rather than haunting, proof that even death could not sever the bonds of family love, but also demonstration that such love must respect the autonomy and development of those it seeks to protect and guide.